Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for another chapter in our ongoing HDI Act podcast series. Today, we're discussing interoperability among agencies and with the local population during multilateral peacekeeping operations. I have the great privilege to be joined today by Dr. Robert Rubenstein. Dr. Rubenstein is an anthropologist with expertise in political and medical anthropology and in social science history and research methods. In political anthropology, Rubenstein's work focuses on cross-cultural aspects of conflict and dispute resolution, including negotiation, mediation, and consensus building. He's an originator of the field of anthropology and peacekeeping. Since 1985, he has conducted empirical research and policy studies in this field. Dr. Rubenstein examines the ways that success of peace operations depend upon cultural considerations and how organizational and institutional cultures can facilitate or frustrate coordination in peacekeeping operations. Dr. Rubenstein has collaborated on policy applications of his work with the International Peace Academy, the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and the United States Army Peacekeeping Institute. As a medical anthropologist, Dr. Rubenstein focused on conflict and health, disparities in access to health care, and the implications of those disparities on the health of the population, as well as the integration of qualitative and quantitative research methodologies. Robert has developed community-based health interventions in Egypt and in Atlanta. Rubenstein has collaborated on health policy issues with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Carter Center, the Georgia Department of Physical Health, and the Onondaga County Health Department. Robert, it's a genuine pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm very grateful for taking time out of a busy schedule to be with us today. So I'd like to kick off our discussion today. As a very junior officer, I was assigned to do a peacekeeping mission in Mogadishu, Somalia. And up until that point, my experience had never included peacekeeping. And a definition of that, I think, often eludes us. So I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on how you would define peacekeeping.
Well, Steve, I'll be happy to respond to that, but let me first thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that really long and awesome introduction. Don't recognize myself in it, but it must be the other Robert Rubenstein. So, but peacekeeping. So peacekeeping is a very, very interesting instrument of international action. It can be traced back beyond 1948 in its origins, but I like to start by looking at it as United Nations peacekeeping multilateral action that's been sanctioned by the United Nations. And there, the history of peacekeeping is an interesting one, and you're not alone in sort of being wondering about what it is that peacekeeping is, because it has developed in a very ad hoc manner. The very first peacekeeping mission was set up in 1948 to monitor the armistice between Israel and its Arab neighbors who had the countries that had attacked it upon its declaration of independence. And they were monitoring an active war for which a ceasefire had been called, but no peace had been negotiated. And it was put together very quickly under the direction of Ralph Bunche. In order to ensure that the armistice stood, in order to be sure that the terms of the armistice were respected, they wanted to put observers to observe the ceasefire lines and the buffer zone. The easiest place, in a sense, to get folks to do that was from the militaries of the member nations of the United Nations. So countries contributed military observers. And in order to mark them off from other soldiers, they spray painted or painted the helmet liners blue, which I think might have been a British Air Force color. I'm not sure of the color. So it's just a happenstance. They had that paint around. So that is how one of the reasons that it's blue. Also, the United Nations uses blue as a color. So they went, and their sole job was to observe the armistice, to maintain an international presence, and they used this then to look at nation states that were fighting, that had had reached a point where they had stopped fighting, and they just wanted to maintain that everybody respected the rules while a peace agreement might be developed.
Right.
So it's kind of interstate buffering. And it was a representation of the focus of the international community on those states, on the conflict. And it worked a great deal in terms of moral persuasion. That is to say, when peacekeeping developed further, here and then beyond, this sort of interstate buffering was intended to allow a face-saving mechanism for states that were fighting that had reached a hurtful stalemate, a stalemate in which neither side was winning. But of course, in these kinds of conflicts, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Israel, the local consumption, the kinds of things that the government said, the leaders said to their people is, we're winning, we're doing great, no problem. So it's very hard for them to step back and say, you know what, we're going to make peace. So or we're going to do a ceasefire. So the moral authority of the United Nations as the international community, very interesting term that we could spend trying to figure out what it is, but in the form of the United Nations, it brought the attention of the international community onto the conflict. It allowed the countries to say, you know, we're really winning, but we want to be respected as a player in the international community, and so we're going to abide by the wishes of the Security Council when they call for a ceasefire, and it gave a way out to do that. So for a while, peacekeeping from 48 to the early 90s was mainly, but not only, that kind of buffering, observation of ceasefire. And it was done by military people, in part because what was being observed were breaches of a conflict. And so if some kind of ordinance was fired, somebody with some skills, military skills and knowledge, would be needed to observe, say, who fired it, what was fired, was it within the agreement or not. So they used to say that peacekeeping is not a job for soldiers, but it's a job that only a soldier could.
So primarily buffering between nation states during this time period?
From 48 to about 92 or 1990, the primary kind of peacekeeping was buffering between nation states. And there were others. There were some transitions, democratic transitions to support the development of votes for the future of a country like in Namibia. But there was also what people call the UN's first war. After independence, when Congo went into a civil war, there was a peacekeeping mission, and part of its mission was to support the government. And the soldiers who were there, the Belgian and other soldiers, actually took up arms, so they fought. But for the most part, peacekeeping was interstate buffering, and out of that, the principles of early peacekeeping developed, and they included that you'd have the consent of the nations on whose territory you were going to be deploying your peacekeeping force, because after all, they had sovereignty, and you were putting military and other personnel there. And that was one of the critical. The consent of the parties was at that point was one of the critical aspects of peacekeeping. That changed. The nature of conflicts changed. So you will recall that in 1991, about when the Soviet Union disaggregated, there was a real shift in geopolitics. Rather than refracting everything through the East-West competition between communism and capitalism, we now had one of the patrons no longer providing support for its clients, and the other patron not having, the United States, not having to provide the same kind of support to counterbalance. So conflicts that we call below the level of the nation state bubbled up. So there had always been conflicts below the level of the nation state. communities that were had differences with one another. And these were managed because of the patronage of the Soviet Union and the United States working through their proxies. When the support from the Soviet Union and the United States either disappeared or changed in nature, those intra-state conflicts bubbled up. And all of a sudden we had all of this ethnic conflict. We saw it in Yugoslavia, we saw it in Rwanda, we saw it in Somalia. And at that time, people were puzzled, analysts were puzzled. They thought with the end of the Soviet Union that there would be a new era of harmony and there would be a great dividend. But here, all of a sudden, we had all these conflicts, and what do we do about them? And there's civil wars as well. So there were ripping countries apart. They were creating humanitarian because of the inability for governments to function effectively. We talked a lot about failed states, states that couldn't provide for their citizens. Those circumstances, the UN Security Council authorized peacekeeping missions, but they changed the nature of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping from 48 to about 1991 was done under Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter, which calls for the pacific resolution of conflicts. Chapter 7 allows the UN to exercise all the necessary means, economic sanctions, boycotts, including military. So when you moved from these interstate conflicts to those that are taking place inside a state, you also moved from Chapter 6 to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 to try and tamp down the fighting, and the idea would be, oh, well, we've got it stopped, and now we'll move back to Chapter 6. But that changed the very nature of peacekeeping right there, that one change. And it was in response to the fact that we had these internal conflicts in failed states. The missions took on a somewhat broader mandate. They were getting broader mandates. They were no longer just enforcing peace. Sometimes they're trying to make peace. Sometimes they had humanitarian crises they had to respond to. NGOs and United Nations specialized agencies working side by side or in the same area of operation. All of a sudden, the concerns of the mission seemed to be more parallel to those of the agencies and NGOs, which was to deliver humanitarian support than before. So you had a more complex situation develop. So some people called it second generation peacekeeping, multifunctional peacekeeping, and so on. Or complex peacekeeping. But it put peacekeepers, basically military people, and their civilian support staff into direct relationship with the agencies and NGOs, more direct than they had before. If you have a failed state or government that's not effective, and you've got warlord or internal conflicts, who do you get consent from? The community. And so the nature of consent changed. So the United Nations started authorizing missions that went in without consent. They went in, therefore, unlike the early peacekeeping, where one of the norms was that peacekeepers would be unarmed, or they'd be armed with sidearms for self-defense. The nature of kinetic action that peacekeepers could take changed, so that the units that were deployed in Yugoslavia and in Somalia and elsewhere turned out to be have a much more, I called it a much more expeditionary character. Changed, and now we've gone on to peace building and peace support operations, and these have used various names. And of course, military doctrine and NGO have sometimes run up against each other in those contexts.
Yeah, absolutely, because it does create for a somewhat messy environment. And I think that absolutely leads us into the next topic that we had wanted to discuss, was that the need for a whole of government approach, an integrated approach, interoperability being key aspects of the ability to do whatever the name, peacemaking, peacekeeping, but is certainly, I thought your statement about peacekeeping shouldn't be done by a military guy, but can only be done by a military guy. But I think we clearly recognize that it requires more of a whole of government type of approach. What are your thoughts on these integrated operations, this interoperability that's necessary to, I would say, be successful in this type of environment?
So I like to think about this in terms of the levels of how closely we're working together. You can be, and I like to start by analogy to say technology, to computers. A long time ago, when I got my first computer, it worked on an operating system called CP/M. That became DOS, and that became Windows. Parallel to that, of course, was the development of the Apple software. Well, you couldn't just in the early days take a cable from my K-Pro computer and plug it into an iMac. They just wouldn't work together. So on a very simple technological level, interoperability means that you can just use the technology like a plug, like a USB plug, and then that USB plug will fit into any machine. It's a standard that we all acknowledge, we all use, and if we say, okay, get a USB cable, we know what it looks like, we know it's going to work, we plug and play it. That's a technological sort of analogy for interoperability. Now, the thing is, I know that engineers will tell you that this is not an easy thing to achieve, and I respect that. From the end user, it looks great. I just plug it in and go. But what I do know as an anthropologist is that people are more complicated than that. And so even if you think you've got a USB plug, by analogy, that's going to work when you get together, it may not. And so there are different ways in which organizations and individuals might work in the same area of operation together. To move this up a bit from into sort of a hybrid of technology and human action, we might decide independently that we want to make a railroad to go from point A, from point B. I'm going to say from Zagreb to Vienna. And so we start working. We don't talk to each other. We just do our own thing. I build my railroad from Zagreb to the border of to the border with Austria. The Austrians build a railroad. Guess what? I come out at one point and they come out at another point. They don't join up. I'm not going to be able to get, because we've just worked alone. We could also cooperate. We could say, okay, we're gonna move, make it possible for us to get from point A to point B. Where do we want to meet up? We could do something a little bit more. We could collaborate. We could say, hey, no, we don't really want it to come to this point. We'd like to have a more direct route, but we negotiate back and forth. We reach a point where we don't object anymore. And so we both build our railroads to the same point under the same schedule. Guess what happens when we get there? You get on a train in Vienna, you get to the border with the former Yugoslavia, you have to change trains. Why? Because the railroad width, the gauge of the tracks, is different. So so interoperability would be that you've come to the same point at the same time with the same gauge track. Now, the reason our gauge tracks are different has to do with matters of social organization and sort of cultural tradition. That gets us into, when we talk about human organizations and people working together, it gets us into having to deal with the way they experience and understand the world.
Yeah, I get that. That's a great analogy for the interoperability. Can you give an example, perhaps, from your experience of where interoperability has been hindered due to, say, a cultural difference?
So there are many such things. I'm gonna give you one from the Somalia. This is an example that I like a lot. It's collected from interviews I had with folks who had served in Somalia. I didn't do direct field work there, just sort of after action interviews. In Somalia, we had a situation where the government was not able to meet the needs of its citizens. There had been a famine as well, and there were competing warlords there. And so we had a very dynamic security situation. And both NGOs, specialized agencies, and military units from peacekeeping mission found themselves in this complex operational environment with warlords where it was very dangerous. And sometimes that became more dangerous and sometimes less. So they knew they had to work together, so they formed a civil military coordinating center. And they assessed every day the situation. And one day, the assessment was that things were getting really dangerous and we had to up our security. And so they left the meeting having decided to up security. And the way this is related to me is that the military did what militaries do. They separated themselves, gave themselves higher position, put out more concertina wire, did whatever it is to separate and maintain their own security bubble. Some of the NGOs, among them Doctors Without Borders, moved deeper into the community. So they saw that they were being more secure if they were being in the community. So the interoperability foundered on a different understanding, different cultural understanding of how one achieves security. So I think that's a telling example. I hope it works for you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example, and it aligns precisely with what my experience was on the ground in Mogadishu. My experience was very much the same. You say it's the old joke about when you secure a building, the Air Force locks the door and turns out the lights, and the Marines surround it, put up concertina wire, and put in machine gun pits. So yeah, absolutely, I think it's an excellent example.
This has been part one of the interoperability among agencies and local population during Multilateral Peacekeeping Operations podcast. The conversation with Dr. Rubenstein continues where it left off in part two, which can be found on the HDIAC website.